3 phone calls in one night changed everything I thought I knew about how power really works in Washington. The first came at 11:47 p.m. from Jennifer Chen, one of my most trusted former intelligence briefers. The second arrived 20 minutes later from Dr. Marcus Hoffman, a contact who specializes in information that never appears in official reports. The third call came from Sarah Rodriguez, who witnessed what happened when Trump finally decided to stop playing games with Chuck Schumer and finish what he started with Mamdani. By the time that third conversation ended, I understood something that most Americans still don't realize. We're not watching separate political crises unfold independently. We're witnessing a coordinated demolition of the old democratic power structure executed with a precision that would make military strategists jealous. "Mr. President," the voice said, and I could hear the exhaustion mixed with something that might have been fear, "you need to understand what happened today wasn't coincidence. Schumer's collapse and Mamdani's meltdown weren't separate events. Trump orchestrated both of them simultaneously, and he did it in a way that nobody saw coming until it was too late to stop." I sat in my study, the same room where I'd made some of the most difficult decisions of my presidency, listening to details that painted a picture of political warfare unlike anything I'd ever seen. This wasn't about policy disagreements or electoral strategy. This was about the systematic destruction of opposition through methods that most people don't even know exist. You see, for weeks, the media had been reporting on what they called a government funding dispute. But what looked like routine political theater was actually something far more sophisticated and dangerous. Trump's team had spent months studying Schumer's psychological profile, his negotiating patterns, his relationships with other Democratic senators, his media strategies, his pressure points, and most importantly, his blind spots. They knew that Schumer's greatest strength was also his greatest vulnerability. He had built his career on being the smartest person in the room, the strategic genius who could outmaneuver Republican opponents through superior knowledge of Senate procedures, better media relationships, and more sophisticated understanding of public opinion dynamics. For decades, that approach had worked brilliantly. Schumer had risen to Senate leadership precisely because he was so effective at traditional political combat. But Trump's people understood something that Schumer didn't. The game had changed. The old rules no longer applied. The traditional sources of political power had been supplemented by capabilities that most career politicians didn't even know existed. While Schumer was planning what he thought would be another routine government funding negotiation, Trump's operation was conducting surveillance that would have impressed professional intelligence agencies. They were monitoring communications between Democratic senators and their staff members. They were tracking financial relationships between Schumer's family members and government contractors. They were analyzing years of private statements, donor communications, and strategic discussions that Schumer thought were completely confidential. More importantly, they were building psychological profiles that revealed exactly how to manipulate Schumer's decision-making process. They knew which issues made him emotional rather than strategic. They understood which kinds of pressure would make him overreach. They had identified the specific circumstances that would cause him to make mistakes that could be exploited later. The setup began 3 weeks before the government funding deadline. Trump started making public statements that seemed designed to provoke Schumer into taking increasingly aggressive positions. Comments about Democratic priorities that were calculated to make Schumer feel like he had to respond forcefully to maintain credibility with his own party. Simultaneously, Trump's people began planning stories and media outlets that painted Schumer as someone who was planning to use the government shutdown as leverage for demands that had nothing to do with keeping federal services operational. These weren't false stories exactly, but they were strategically timed and framed to maximize pressure on Schumer to prove his reasonableness by taking harder positions than he might have chosen otherwise. The psychological manipulation was subtle but devastating. Every time Schumer tried to appear moderate, Trump's surrogates would suggest he was abandoning his principles. Every time he took a strong position, Republican media would characterize him as extremist and irresponsible. He was being pushed toward a negotiating stance that looked principled to Democratic activists but appeared unreasonable to the broader public. By the time serious negotiations began, Schumer had been maneuvered into a position where he almost had to take a hard line to maintain credibility with his own party. He was demanding concessions that he probably knew were unlikely to be accepted, but his public statements had made it politically impossible for him to compromise without appearing to cave to Republican pressure. Trump, meanwhile, was positioning himself as the reasonable party willing to negotiate. His public statements emphasized his desire to keep the government running while protecting essential services for American families. He appeared calm, presidential, focused on governance rather than political games. The contrast was stark and strategically planned. Schumer looked like someone prioritizing partisan objectives over public welfare. Trump looked like someone trying to solve problems while dealing with unreasonable opposition. But the real brilliance of the operation became apparent during what was supposed to be a routine press conference about the ongoing negotiations. Schumer stood at the podium, confident in his talking points, ready to blame Republicans for the government shutdown and paint himself as the defender of American workers and vulnerable families. He had no idea what was about to hit him. Trump had other plans. Instead of responding through traditional channels, instead of holding his own press conference or releasing statements through official spokespeople, Trump activated a network that had been months in the making. Journalists who had been quietly investigating Democratic leadership practices, analysts who had been building cases about conflicts of interest in Senate operations, former government officials who had been documenting ethical concerns about how senior Democrats conducted business. The attack came in waves, each one perfectly timed to maximize damage while maintaining plausible deniability about coordination with Trump's official operation. The setup was brilliant in its simplicity. Trump knew exactly which pressure points would make Schumer overreach. He understood precisely how to manipulate the media coverage to make Schumer look unreasonable. Most importantly, he had information about Schumer's position that Schumer himself didn't know Trump possessed. While Schumer was planning his public relations strategy, Trump's people were 3 steps ahead. They knew which Democratic senators were getting nervous about the shutdown's impact on their home states. They knew which donors were getting frustrated with Schumer's leadership. They knew which media outlets were starting to question whether Democratic intransigence was really serving the party's long-term interests. But here's what makes this truly devastating. Trump didn't just outmaneuver Schumer politically. He exposed him personally in a way that ensures Schumer will never have the same kind of influence again. The moment came during what was supposed to be a routine press conference about the ongoing negotiations. Schumer stood at the podium, confident in his talking points, ready to blame Republicans for the government shutdown and paint himself as the defender of American workers and vulnerable families. Trump had other plans. Instead of responding through traditional channels, instead of holding his own press conference or releasing statements through spokespeople, Trump did something that caught everyone off guard. He started releasing information, not through official government sources, but through a network of journalists and analysts who had been quietly building cases against Democratic leadership for months. The first wave was financial. Documents showing how Schumer's family members had benefited from government contracts during his tenure as Senate leader. Not illegal necessarily, but ethically questionable enough to raise serious questions about conflicts of interest and whether Schumer had been using his position to enrich his relatives. The second wave was operational. Communications showing how Schumer's office had been coordinating with lobby groups to shape legislation in ways that benefited major corporate donors rather than the working-class Americans he claimed to represent. The third wave was personal. Information about Schumer's private statements regarding his own constituents, his real opinion of progressive activists, and his strategic calculations that prioritized his own political survival over his party's success. By the time Schumer realized what was happening, the damage was irreversible. This wasn't opposition research being deployed during an election campaign where both sides expect personal attacks and voters are somewhat prepared for negative information about candidates. This was a sitting senator getting systematically destroyed during what should have been routine government negotiations. The media coverage shifted overnight. Instead of debating the merits of different spending priorities, journalists were asking why Schumer hadn't disclosed his family's financial connections to government contractors. Instead of focusing on the shutdown's impact on federal workers, news outlets were analyzing whether Schumer had been honest with his own party about his negotiating strategy. Most devastatingly, Democratic senators who had been supporting Schumer's hard line began distancing themselves publicly, not because they disagreed with his policy positions necessarily, but because association with him was becoming politically toxic for anyone with ambitions beyond defending Chuck Schumer's reputation. The psychological impact on Schumer was visible to anyone paying attention. During his next public appearance, he looked like someone who had been hit by a truck he never saw coming. The confident, combative Senate leader was replaced by someone who seemed unsure of his own talking points, defensive about questions he should have anticipated, and visibly struggling to maintain composure under pressure that would have been routine just days earlier. But Trump wasn't finished, because while Schumer was dealing with the collapse of his political position, Mamdani was experiencing something even worse. And this is where the true sophistication of Trump's operation became clear. These weren't separate initiatives happening to coincide by chance. They were interconnected components of a comprehensive strategy designed to demonstrate Trump's capabilities to multiple audiences simultaneously. Remember, Mamdani thought he had survived his encounter with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. After that disastrous 4-hour meeting, he had managed to return to his country without any immediate consequences becoming visible to his superiors. His government hadn't learned about the complete failure of his mission, his reputation within intelligence circles was still intact, and he believed he could rebuild his influence through alternative channels and different approaches. What Mamdani didn't understand was that his survival was temporary and conditional. Trump's people had deliberately allowed him to leave that meeting thinking he might recover from his defeat. Not out of mercy or diplomatic courtesy, but because they wanted to study his response patterns, monitor his attempts to regroup, and identify every connection in his network before moving to the final phase of his destruction. For weeks after the Mar-a-Lago meeting, Mamdani operated normally. He filed reports with his government that minimized the extent of his failure. He maintained his cover relationships with diplomatic contacts who had no idea what had actually happened during his encounter with Trump. He continued participating in intelligence operations that his superiors believed he was still qualified to handle. But every move he made was being monitored, analyzed, and documented by a surveillance operation that made his own country's intelligence capabilities look primitive by comparison. Trump's people were reading his communications before his intended recipients saw them. They were tracking his financial transactions through banking systems he thought were secure. They were monitoring his physical movements through surveillance networks he didn't even know existed. More dangerously, they were building comprehensive profiles of everyone in his professional and personal networks, family members who had no idea they were being observed, professional colleagues who thought their associations with Mamdani were completely private, government officials in his home country who believed their relationships with Mamdani were protected by diplomatic protocols and national security classifications. Trump's team was essentially mapping Mamdani's entire world, identifying every relationship that mattered to him, every vulnerability that could be exploited, every pressure point that could be used to destroy not just his career, but his ability to function in any capacity within his country's power structure. The psychological warfare began subtly. Anonymous tips to journalists in his home country about financial irregularities and programs Mamdani had overseen during his career. Questions raised by opposition political figures about his handling of intelligence operations that had resulted in setbacks for national interest. Whispered concerns among his colleagues about whether certain failed missions might have been compromised by security breaches in his operations. None of these inquiries were dramatic enough to trigger immediate consequences, but they created an atmosphere of suspicion and doubt that gradually undermined confidence in Mamdani's competence and reliability. His superiors began asking more detailed questions about his activities. His subordinates started being more cautious about sharing sensitive information with his office. His sources in other countries became hesitant about maintaining contact with someone who might be under suspicion. Then came the documentation phase. Carefully sourced reports in international media outlets about specific operations Mamdani had conducted that had resulted in casualties among American personnel. Not fabricated stories, but factual accounts of missions that had gone wrong, presented in contexts that suggested Mamdani's judgment or loyalty might be questionable. Evidence of communications between Mamdani and individuals who were known to have connections to groups his government considered terrorist organizations. Again, not false information, but real communications presented in ways that raised questions about whether Mamdani had been operating outside his authorized parameters or pursuing personal agendas that conflicted with official policy. Financial records showing transactions between accounts associated with Mamdani and entities that were prohibited by international sanctions regimes. Complex arrangements that might have been technically legal, but appeared highly questionable when presented without the context that would explain their legitimate purposes. Each revelation was carefully timed and strategically placed to maximize damage to Mamdani's standing while maintaining plausible deniability about the sources of the information. His government couldn't accuse American intelligence agencies of conducting unauthorized operations because the stories were appearing in foreign publications that claimed to have developed the information independently. His colleagues couldn't dismiss the allegations as politically motivated because the evidence being presented appeared credible and was consistent with operational details that only someone with insider knowledge could have provided. Most devastatingly, Mamdani couldn't defend himself effectively because doing so would require revealing details about his failed mission to Mar-a-Lago, which would expose the complete extent of his defeat and make his situation even worse than the current allegations suggested. Within 2 weeks, Mamdani had gone from being one of the most influential intelligence operatives in his region to someone who couldn't get meetings with officials who had previously sought his advice on major policy decisions. His access to sensitive information was quietly restricted, his operational assignments were reassigned to other personnel, his communications were being monitored by his own government security services. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of his destruction was how clearly it demonstrated the futility of resistance. Every move Mamdani made to defend himself or rebuild his position was anticipated and countered before it could have any effect. Every ally he approached for support had already been provided with information that made association with him professionally dangerous. Every strategy he attempted was neutralized by people who seemed to understand his capabilities better than he understood them himself. But the real brilliance of Trump's strategy became apparent when you looked at how the Schumer and Mamdani operations were coordinated. These weren't separate initiatives happening to unfold at the same time. They were connected components of a larger strategy designed to send a message to anyone thinking about challenging Trump's agenda. The message to Democratic leaders: we know more about you than you think we do, and we're prepared to use that information if you push us too far. The message to foreign officials: your governments can't protect you if we decide you're a problem that needs to be solved. The message to journalists and prosecutors: we have resources you don't understand and capabilities you haven't imagined. The message to anyone else who might be considering opposition: look what happened to Schumer and Mamdani, and ask yourself whether you're prepared for the same treatment. What makes this particularly terrifying is how legal most of it appears to be. The information about Schumer came through sources that seem to have operated within the bounds of legitimate journalism and opposition research. The campaign against Mamdani was conducted through foreign media outlets that were reporting factual information about questionable activities. No laws were obviously broken. No government agencies were clearly misused. No illegal surveillance was apparently conducted. But the results were complete and total destruction of two experienced political operators who thought they understood how these games were played. This is the new reality of American politics. Not the democracy I served for 8 years, where disagreements were resolved through debate and compromise and mutual respect for institutional norms. This is something else entirely. A system where opposition becomes a personal risk that most people aren't prepared to accept. I keep thinking about that phone call, about the exhaustion in that voice when they told me what they had witnessed. Because what happened to Schumer and Mamdani wasn't just about two individuals getting outmaneuvered. It was a demonstration of capabilities that could be deployed against anyone, anytime, for any reason that serves Trump's interest. Every Democratic senator now has to consider whether taking a strong position against Trump's agenda is worth the risk of having their own background subjected to the same kind of scrutiny that destroyed Schumer's credibility. Every foreign official has to wonder whether their communications are being monitored, whether their activities are being documented, whether their careers could be ended with a few strategic media leaks. Every journalist investigating Trump's business dealings has to consider whether their own financial arrangements, personal relationships, and professional activities could withstand the kind of comprehensive examination that Schumer and Mamdani experienced. The chilling effect is already visible to anyone paying attention. Democratic opposition to Trump's nominees has become notably less aggressive. Foreign governments are being more cautious about challenging American positions in international forums. Media coverage of Trump's activities has become more circumspect, with fewer investigative pieces and more straightforward reporting of official statements. This isn't happening because people suddenly agree with Trump's policies. It's happening because they've seen what happens to people who oppose him too vigorously, and most of them aren't prepared to accept those consequences. The transformation of American politics is now complete. We've moved from a system where power was constrained by institutional norms and democratic accountability to something where individual leaders can destroy opponents through information warfare that operates outside traditional legal and political constraints. Schumer's bluff wasn't just called, it was obliterated in a way that ensures no Democratic leader will make the same mistake again. Mamdani didn't just fail in his mission, he was systematically destroyed as an example to any other foreign operative thinking about challenging American interests. And the message has been received. Loud and clear, the old rules are gone, the old protections don't exist. The old assumptions about what's possible in American politics no longer apply. What happened to Schumer and Mamdani is what happens to anyone who underestimates the new Trump operation. Complete, total, devastating defeat, not through superior arguments or better policies or democratic processes, through raw information, warfare deployed by people who understand that knowledge is power, and that power unconstrained by ethical limitations can reshape reality itself. This is the America we live in now, and most people have no idea how fundamentally everything has changed. And the phone calls that night were just the beginning of my education about how fundamentally American politics had changed. Since then, I've learned about similar operations targeting other Democratic leaders, other foreign officials, other journalists who thought they could challenge this system without understanding what they were really facing. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came 3 weeks later when I received a folder containing detailed analyses of how the Schumer and Mamdani operations had been studied by political strategists around the world. Foreign governments were scrambling to understand whether their own officials might be vulnerable to similar attacks. Opposition parties in democratic countries were analyzing whether Trump's methods could be adapted for their own political warfare. Authoritarian regimes were studying Trump's techniques as potential models for suppressing dissent more effectively. The implications extend far beyond American politics. What happened to Schumer and Mamdani represents a fundamental shift in how power operates in the modern world. Traditional constraints on political combat, diplomatic immunity, professional norms, ethical limitations, legal boundaries, all of these safeguards that made democratic governance possible are being systematically dismantled by people who understand that information warfare can achieve objectives that would be impossible through conventional means. I keep thinking about conversations I had with foreign leaders during my presidency, discussions about the importance of maintaining international law, diplomatic protocols, and mutual respect for sovereignty, even during periods of intense disagreement. Those conversations seem almost quaint now, relics of an era when people believed that certain boundaries couldn't be crossed without triggering consequences that would make such tactics self-defeating. Trump's operation has proven that those boundaries were more fragile than anyone realized. When you have sufficient technological capabilities, financial resources, and operational sophistication, you can destroy opponents without violating any laws that would trigger meaningful retaliation. You can gather information through channels that are technically legal but practically indistinguishable from espionage. You can deploy that information through networks that maintain plausible deniability about coordination with official government agencies. The result is a form of political warfare that's almost impossible to defend against through traditional means. How do you protect yourself from opposition research that's more comprehensive than anything intelligence agencies conduct against foreign adversaries? How do you maintain operational security when your opponents have access to surveillance capabilities that most governments don't possess? How do you build coalition when every potential ally knows they could be subjected to the same treatment if they associate with you? These aren't hypothetical questions anymore. Every Democratic leader planning to challenge Trump's agenda has to consider whether their own backgrounds can withstand the kind of scrutiny that destroyed Schumer's credibility. Every foreign official conducting business with American counterparts has to wonder whether their communications are being monitored and their activities documented for potential future use. The chilling effect is already transforming how politics operates. Democratic opposition to Trump's initiatives has become notably less aggressive since the Schumer incident. Foreign governments are being more accommodating in international negotiations, not necessarily because they agree with American positions, but because they've seen what happens to officials who resist too vigorously. Media coverage of Trump's administration has become more circumspect, with fewer investigative pieces and more straightforward reporting of official statements. Not because journalists have stopped being curious about potential stories, but because they've watched what happened to colleagues who pursued certain types of investigations too aggressively. Academic researchers studying Trump's policies and business relationships have become more cautious about their methodologies and conclusions, not because the evidence has changed, but because they've observed the consequences that can result from publishing findings that certain people find inconvenient. The transformation is comprehensive and accelerating. We're moving toward a political system where opposition becomes personally dangerous for anyone who isn't prepared to accept consequences that go far beyond electoral defeat or policy disagreements. But here's what worries me most about this development. It's not just that Trump has built this capability, it's that he's demonstrated its effectiveness so clearly that other political actors will inevitably attempt to develop similar systems. We're already seeing evidence that Democratic organizations are trying to build their own opposition research and information warfare capabilities. Not because they want to engage in this kind of combat, but because they've concluded that traditional political methods are insufficient for competing against opponents who operate according to different rules. Foreign governments are investing heavily in technologies and techniques that could allow them to conduct similar operations against American officials, not necessarily because they want to interfere in American politics, but because they need defensive capabilities that can protect their own officials from the kind of treatment Mamdani experienced. Private intelligence firms are expanding their operations and client bases, recognizing that demand for comprehensive background investigations and strategic information deployment is growing rapidly across multiple sectors. The result will be an escalating cycle of information warfare that makes traditional political competition almost impossible to sustain. When every political actor is trying to gather compromising information about every other political actor, when personal destruction becomes the primary tool of political combat, when privacy disappears for anyone who participates in public discourse, we're not living in a democracy anymore. We're living in something that maintains democratic institutions and uses democratic language, but operates according to principles that would be familiar to anyone who has studied how authoritarian systems actually function. The forms remain the same, but the substance has been fundamentally altered. Schumer's bluff wasn't just called, it was obliterated in a demonstration that ensures no Democratic leader will make similar miscalculations in the future. Mamdani didn't just fail in his mission, he was systematically destroyed as an example to any other foreign operative considering whether to challenge American interests through traditional intelligence methods. and the message has been received throughout the political system. Loud, clear, and absolutely terrifying in its implications for anyone who still believes that democratic governance depends on the possibility of meaningful opposition to those who hold power. The America I served as president for 8 years no longer exists. What's replaced it looks similar from the outside, but operates according to rules that make traditional democratic competition almost impossible for anyone who isn't prepared to engage in total warfare against their opponents. Most Americans have no idea how fundamentally everything has changed. They're still thinking about politics in terms of policy disagreements and electoral strategies and media coverage. They don't understand that they're witnessing the emergence of a system where information dominance can overrule democratic processes, where personal destruction can substitute for political debate, where fear of retaliation can silence opposition more effectively than any authoritarian decree. The phone calls that night opened my eyes to a reality that most people haven't recognized yet. We're living through the transformation of American democracy into something else entirely, something that uses familiar language and maintains familiar institutions but operates according to principles that would make the founders of this country recognize the emergence of exactly the kind of concentrated power they tried to prevent through constitutional limitations and democratic processes. The question isn't whether this transformation can be reversed. The capabilities exist, the methods have been proven effective, and the incentives for using them are too powerful for any individual leader to resist. The question is whether enough people will recognize what's happening in time to develop responses that can preserve some meaningful form of democratic governance before the transformation becomes irreversible. Based on what I learned from those phone calls and what I continue to learn from sources who are watching this system expand and evolve, I'm increasingly pessimistic about our chances of maintaining anything that resembles the democracy we inherited from previous generations. But I keep speaking about these developments because people need to understand what they're really facing. Not the democracy they remember from civics textbooks or historical narratives, but the reality of how power actually operates in modern America. The game has changed, the players have changed, the rules have changed, and most Americans are still playing by an older rule book while their opponents have already mastered rules they don't even know exist.